Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. This week, we'll cover diplomatic visits, EVs in Singapore, and a new AI race.
We'll also cover Lunar New Year travel plans and celebrations for the Year of the Snake. Today is February 6th, 2025. This week, Greg and Elina are joined by Yoon Soon to discuss China's policy in Myanmar. Before that, let's start with our headlines. We're kicking off our episode this week with a stop in India. Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto visited India for the first time since taking office to meet with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, where he was the guest of honor at India's 76th Republic Day celebrations in Delhi.
This visit has been making headlines not only for its outcomes, but also because Prabowo recently discovered that he has Indian ancestry. Prabowo had Modi cracking up with jokes about his compulsion to start dancing whenever he hears Indian music because of his Indian DNA.
Okay, cute. Could Prabowo be the next big star in Bollywood?
I think being president of the world's fourth most populated country will keep him busy enough.
Okay, fair. And he was very busy on this trip. Prabowo and Modi signed a number of new agreements in maritime security, cybersecurity, counterterrorism, and health. Prabowo also thanked Prime Minister Modi for his support in Indonesia's application to join BRICS. Modi said that the two countries are discussing cooperation on supply chains and defense manufacturing.
These are some big developments to watch for the Indonesia-India relationship. But that wasn't all for Prabowo. Straight after India, he headed to Malaysia on an invitation from the Malaysian king, Sultan Ibrahim Iskandar of Johor.
That's right. He also met with Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. There were fewer outcomes from Prabowo's meeting with Anwar than his India trip, but he was conferred the most esteemed Order of the Johor Royal One, a high military honor by the king, who has known Prabowo for over 40 years from their military training here in the U.S.
That's a big diplomatic week for Indonesia, and Prabowo received quite the welcome from his hosts in India and Malaysia. Our next story is an update from a topic that we covered a couple episodes back. In Singapore, Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer BYD has overtaken Toyota for the highest-selling car in Singapore in 2024.
That's a big step for EVs in the country. BYD sold 6,191 cars, narrowly beating out the 5,736 cars sold by Toyota in the same period. They also outsold Tesla, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW, winning 14% of Singapore's car market.
That's a lot of cars. The change from Toyota to BYD reflects a regional shift towards Chinese car makers as they break into the international car market. Facing restrictions in North America and Europe, Southeast Asia offers the perfect market for BYD to have the greatest impact.
Right, and BYD's success in Singapore is especially notable because of the country's high taxes and steep regulations to own a car. Singapore maintains incentives for EVs, including plans for car charging infrastructure and EV purchase rebates, in line with Singapore's goal of reaching net zero.
With those incentives, it sounds like this could be the first year of many to come with BYD sales topping those of Toyota and other competitors.
Speaking of competition, an AI race calls data centers in Malaysia and throughout Southeast Asia into question. Malaysia has long been seeking to establish itself as a regional digital hub, encouraging investment by tech firms to help nurture its growing industry. But there are concerns that developments around Chinese AI company DeepSeek might upset Southeast Asian tech development.
That's right. Last week, DeepSeek unveiled an AI model called R1, which is very similar to OpenAI's O1, designed to complement ChatGPT. Except its advantage is that it can operate at a fraction of the cost of OpenAI, Google, and Meta AI models.
And if DeepSeek's V3 model, which was developed at just $5.6 million is any indication of how cost-efficient the newer R1 model is, American models may not be able to compete, with OpenAI's ChatGPT-4 model reportedly costing around $100 million to train.
That truly is a fraction of the cost, but what does that mean for Malaysia and Southeast Asia as a whole?
The prices of stocks for technology companies around the world are plummeting, from Wall Street to Bursa Malaysia, the Malaysian stock market. Beyond stocks, Malaysia was the top destination for data center investment in Southeast Asia in 2024, with an incoming investment of $32.2 billion.
But for how relatively cheap DeepSeek's claimed costs are to develop AI models, any attempts at American companies to match these prices could result in a lower demand for chips, power plants, and data centers themselves. For Malaysia and data centers across Southeast Asia, the value of these billions of dollars of investments would diminish.
Exactly. That's definitely going to be something to watch over the coming months as AI development continues. But despite any potential losses Malaysia and the rest of the region could experience this month from AI-related costs, they may be making up in tourism with Lunar New Year bookings. In particular, Thailand looks to gain the most from this festive time of the year, with the country geared up to welcome an expected 770,000 Chinese nationals to celebrate the Year of the Snake.
That makes sense given Chinese nationals are one of the world's largest pools of outbound tourists to Thailand. But wasn't there some commotion a few weeks ago that caused Chinese tourists to reconsider Lunar New Year vacation destinations?
You're right about that. Chinese actor Wang Xing went missing in a scam operation out of a Myanmar city bordering Thailand. Although he was later found by the Thai authorities, disoriented and with his head shaved, there are still fears among Chinese nationals that traveling to Thailand is a safety concern.
That's horrifying. The safety concern is certainly reflected in the decline in the number of bookings to Thailand from China for the New Year holiday. In the period of January 13th to the 20th compared to previous weeks, the number of bookings decreased by 15.6%.
Which means that some tourists are either changing or canceling their plans. And as far as alternative destinations go, it looks like Japan and Malaysia are the most popular with an 86% and 79.2% increase respectively through January 20th over the same period. I wish I could travel to Japan or Malaysia for the Lunar New Year.
Me too, but celebrations aren't just limited to Thailand, Japan, or Malaysia. Indonesia kicked off the new year with dragon dances, puppet shows, and drum performances throughout Java. Cambodia also held a dragon dance performance in front of the royal palace in Phnom Penh.
Sounds like a great way to keep bad luck away and welcome prosperity for the year to come. Happy Lunar New Year, everyone.
大家新年快乐! Did we miss anything that you wanted to hear about? If so, please write us at scaradio@csis.org or DM us on your favorite social media platform. Up next, Greg and Elina's conversation with Yoon Soon. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, folks. I am Greg Poling with CSIS, joined as always by Elina Noor of the Carnegie Endowment. Hey, Elina.
Howdy, Greg.
We've gotten lots of mail asking where you were last episode. People were very, very upset to only have to hear me.
I almost forgot I was not on the last episode, so I couldn't tell you where I was.
Okay. Hear that, folks? She had nothing better to do. Just didn't feel like getting on the podcast. In all seriousness, though, welcome back. And today we're joined by Yoon Soon as our special guest. Yoon is a senior fellow and the director of the China program at the Stimson Center, where, among many other things, she focuses on China's policy in Myanmar. Hey, Yoon.
Hi, Greg. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on for what we hope is a timely episode. This will air just after the anniversary of the February 1st, 2021 coup in Myanmar. So here we are, 4 years already into this civil war. And I think the talk of the region when it comes to Myanmar for months now has been the plan for elections, for the junta to hold national elections sometime in the coming year, and China's very explicit support for those elections. So maybe we start there, or you can use that as a launching off point to talk China policy in Myanmar overall. What's Beijing's play here back in the elections?
Boy, that's a giant question.
And you have 2 minutes.
I have 2 minutes. Okay, well, I'll take one. The Chinese calculus towards Myanmar, well, the Chinese want three things in Myanmar, right? They want border stability, they want the connectivity projects, basically the access to the Bay of Bengal, and last but not least, they don't want Americans in the country or along their border. So those are pretty much the three top priorities for China's policy in the country. And they have, well, remember, the Chinese have been coexisting with Myanmar for more than 70 decades. And they have coexisted with the civil war, this ongoing conflict in the country for more than 7 decades.
And sometimes contributed to the civil wars in a very direct way.
Very direct way or indirect way or both. So I think for the Chinese, when they look at the past 4 years, this is much worse than what they had experienced historically. You could say that, well, the country, after 10 years of political liberalization, was never going to go back to before. And the military does not have the same capability to control its population like it did before 2010. But some would call the balkanization of the country in the past 4 years has led to this essential question: what do we do next? I think one judgment the Chinese have had about the country is that this is a stalemate on the battlefield. The resistance is unable to push the military out of the Burma dry zone or the heartland. And the military is unable to wipe out the resistance, the PDF and the groups either. So we're looking at a long stalemate, the pulling and hauling between these two oppositional forces. And without some sort of turning the page, this stalemate is just going to continue. So I think for China, election, and I think they have very sober understanding that this will not be free or fair or representative of the majority of the population in the country, but the election could be regarded or could function as a reset for the country to force the country to move forward. And the historical precedent that they would cite was the election in 2010, which was also staged by the Burmese military. but it was able to basically shepherd the country in the direction of political reform. So I think the Chinese hope is that the election in 2025 will turn the page on the coup and have a semi-legitimate or pseudo-democratic government, which hopefully will adopt a different set of policies like the previous Johnson government did, and then turn a new page so that the country can move on.
I mean,
That's
there
a
are
hope.
no good options for any party involved in this, right? And so it seems as if, from what you said, there's a lot of hope that the elections will enable a reset in governance in Myanmar. Is there a plan B for the Chinese if that doesn't go according to hope?
I think the plan B is what we have today, which is a stalemate on the battlefield that neither side is able to push the other side out. So if the election transpires to be something that could potentially turn a new page, that would be good news. If it doesn't, then there's a continuation of this, right? And the hope is that if the new government produced by the election is able to adopt conciliatory measures, because it will have a little bit more legitimacy than the current SAC, then that government will have a better chance to settle and to negotiate with the PDF and with the resistance. And that's the other reason why there's no good solution, because why would anyone negotiate with SAC? They don't have legitimacy. They're not going to stay here forever. So any agreement reached with them is not going to be legally viable or legally justifiable beyond the next government. So negotiation approach in the current climate is unlikely to transpire. So there has to be someone or some institution that can represent the central government and act as a negotiating partner.
I hear growing concern within other parts of the region, among particularly the maritime South Asian countries that are most critical of the SAC, that not only would an election be illegitimate because, it would happen in less than half of the townships in the country, but because it would clearly ignore the wishes of even those in the township, only those who are going to vote for the military are likely to come out in the first place. But there's also a growing recognition that it's more likely to increase violence than decrease it. You're going to take areas of the country that are still under SAC control, the junta's control, at least nominally, and you're going to create thousands of soft targets and encourage the EROs and the PDFs to attack those in order to delegitimize the election. I don't know if China doesn't see that, disagrees with the analysis, doesn't care, but I think there's growing worry that the election actually becomes a trigger for yet another escalation of violence.
I think that's definitely a viable concern. I think that's very actually realistic. The first thing about the election, here's the deal. According to the 2008 constitution, the military by default has 25% of the parliament seats, right? So technically speaking, they only need 25.1% of the vote to be the majority because they already have 25%. So if you think about that number, I would say that is potentially more probable compared to them actually have to win 50% of the votes in the country. And I agree with you. I think the township issue, how many townships can the polling be held? Since that's a very delicate calculations, I've seen various numbers. I think it still goes back to the essential question. If not this, then what? Remember, the premise that we're operating upon is that, if the resistance can push the military out, I think the Chinese will be very pleased to embrace that outcome. But the fact is that they can't. We have seen in the past 4 years that they're not able to. And some of the argument in recent months or in the past year and a half is that, look, since Operation 1027, the ethnic armed groups are making great progress in terms of territorial occupation in the country, which is true, but that goes back to, what enabled Operation 1027? China. So in the Chinese view, Operation 1027 was not an organic indigenous movement that happened in a vacuum. It was because of the Chinese consent, and like you pointed out earlier, because of Chinese support that Operation 1027 was successful. But now the Chinese changed their position that, we're no longer willing to let the EAOs to make such an advancement. We still see that in the end, the country needs some sort of reconciliation to move forward. We also don't believe that the Burmese military can be pushed out. So that period is officially over, I would say, by August of 2024, when the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Naypyidaw and explicitly expressed China's support for this election. That has already turned the page on China's policy.
I mean, I think that's the fundamental question that you identified, right? If not this, then what? But China has come under some amount, maybe even heavy criticism for its continued support of legitimizing the junta. And maybe that's fair, maybe that's unfair. But I mean, as I pointed out earlier, there are just no good options, right? And so is it Beijing's position that whatever fire it receives from the outside, it's still going to carry on with its position and its policy until some sort of viable resolution, whatever that might look like to Beijing, comes about? And maybe that viable option is eventually, if this election goes according to hope, maybe not planned, different parties can come to the table and negotiate some sort of outcome that might be satisfactory, first of all, to the Myanmar constituents themselves, but then also to Beijing. Is that the play here right now?
Yeah, I don't think the Chinese are terribly worried about any political force in Myanmar to be pro-West. They've seen Aung San Suu Kyi, they've seen NUG basically pledging their, maybe not allegiance, but at least pledging their very strong willingness to cooperate with China. They all recognize the fact that China is the largest neighbor in the north, is a force to be reckoned with. So they're not necessarily concerned that any future political force in the country will be anti-China. That's not the concern. I think the concern is the continuation of the chaos, that this will continue indefinitely, which, remember, the Chinese top 3 priorities, border stability. Now they have, in a way, border stability because they can control the EAOs who control the border. But the stability in northern Myanmar, outside the cyber scam operation, also is counterintuitive in a way because it blocks China in. If China wants access to the Indian Ocean, it needs to go to the west coast of Myanmar. And if everything down south from northern Myanmar is in military instability, military conflict, and in a chaos, then for China, their connectivity projects to reach the Bay of Bengal, that's just not going to happen. So if you look at the long-term Chinese desire in the country, I think their desire for the stability is not just for the sake of Myanmar, but it's also for China's own policy agenda. But the question is, how do you get there? If not election, then what? Weirdly enough, I think the Chinese have been trying to find an alternative in the country. In fact, after the coup, the Chinese desired a solution in the country is for Myanmar Online and Aung San Suu Kyi to have a deal. You two work it out. Make sure that the military NLD somehow can find a way forward so it doesn't have to come to this. Because at least NLD has an organization, right? NUG has very weak power to control the different elements of the resistance. And you're looking at hundreds of, if not thousands of PDF forces and different cells operating in the country. That's much more difficult to manage. So the Chinese preferred solution originally, or I would say that even after they announced the support for election, is for NLD and the military to come together and have a deal. But that did not happen either. So the Chinese turned around to look at the NUG. I've written about how Chinese see the legitimacy of NUG as problematic because they only have limited number of the elected MPs. But I think the fundamental problem with NUG is that does it have the capacity to lead this revolution? Does it have ability to rein in or to manage conflicts from within? Does it have a proper answer for the Burma asking minority questions, the asking reconciliation question? Or NUG, where does it come from and where is it going? I think when the Chinese look at the different political forces within the resistance and try to identify a viable alternative, they didn't see one, which brings them back to the original assessment that, maybe an election and some sort of reconciliation after the election will be the best hope here, since the resistance is not a coherent one voice and one organization either. But the challenge I have for the Chinese is that, what if Myanmar Online wants to be the president? What if he decides that, I'm running this election, I'll get 25% of the votes that I needed, and I want to be the president. Why should I not? I waited my whole life. I managed the country as acting president, and now let's legitimize it. Let's put a ring on it and make sure that I get to be the president of the country for the next 5 years. I think that will bury the chance of any genuine reconciliation that the Chinese have been hoping for, and they have to deal with that scenario.
It seems to me that while China has the most influence of any outside party, although I guess Thailand rivals that in some cases. So in some quarters it's China, in some quarters it's Thailand. But even China's influence is far less than it seems to me Beijing thinks. As you said, Beijing's assessment is that ERO gains are only because China supported Operation 1027, and yet they're still unable to rein in the Arakan army, which is easily the most successful of any of the EROs. Kachin Independence Army made significant gains in November and December despite China's demands for ceasefires, and I think was able to negotiate from a position of some leverage with Beijing over the reopening of border areas. China has no influence with the K2C, the Karen, Karenian Chin, because the relationship with the MNDAA and the United Wa State Army works so well for Beijing. Beijing assumes, therefore, controls or can leverage all of the EROs. I don't see any evidence of that.
I don't think that's what China wants to do anyway. Like I said, they care about the border stability. And that's primarily Shan State, right? And the Kachin State, yes, there is a very long shared border. But I think for the Kachin State, the border to stay open, it makes economic sense for both sides of the border. So in my observation, Beijing's control or Beijing's influence is primarily with the EAOs along the China-Myanmar border. They have much less control or influence over, for example, the Karen. Otherwise, they would have dealt with Myanmar in a much more forceful manner. I think AA is a separate case. So far, AA has not, let me know if I'm wrong, I could be, AA has not done anything in direct or evident violation of China's desires.
I think that the AA has been careful to avoid areas where its desires and those of China conflict. And there's no cost for that. Other than very early shelling of Chaokpu, they've since then avoided any threat to the Chinese invested port at Chaokpu. And otherwise, they're free to do anything they want. So there's really nowhere where they have to make a choice.
Yeah.
And to a degree, that's even been true of the National Liberation Army as well, the TNLA. It was really only the MNDAA and the taking of Lasho where you really, I think, saw an ERO's efforts and the interests of Beijing directly conflict.
Yeah, we need to see how that Lasho question is being resolved. I think that actually reflects a pattern of China's relationship with these EAOs or EROs, that Beijing's desire is not to manage every single of their activities. It's not to manage that how far they will go or how far they will not go and what kind of battleground or the field decisions that they will make. It's more about respecting Beijing's bottom lines. There are certain red lines that China would set. Like, for example, things are cool. Part of the key engagement that China has had with PDF and with NUG is about the protection of Chinese assets and nationals on the ground. So that's a explicit red line or bottom line issue that Beijing has basically told the resistance directly. And on top of that, I don't think the Chinese really have had a set of instructions as for, what do you need to do or how far you need to go. I think Beijing still has a fairly laissez-faire approach to the EROs until their actions and activities become a problem.
I mean, speaking of, you mentioned border stability several times as one of Beijing's key interests in this. But border stability doesn't necessarily equate to border safety, right? And of course, some Chinese interests and assets have been risked in areas that they don't have direct influence over, like Myanmar, you mentioned. How is this seen within China in terms of its implicit laissez-faire approach or even explicit laissez-faire approach to some of the Myanmar elements concerning these areas like Myanmar?
Yeah, that's a problem with the cyber operations. When they first launched Operation 1027 and drove them away, wiped them out from the northern Myanmar along the China border, soon they realized that cyber scams only need two things to run: electricity and internet. And they can move anywhere. In fact, Dubai has a very large operation of the same model. But I think the essential problem, now what we're seeing is, if you recall, back in 2011, there was that Mekong killing incident. And the Chinese made the movie about the Mekong operation, how the Chinese special agents were operating in the region to drive out the drug lords that violated China's bottom line interest. I think the Chinese approach to this is going to be a joint law enforcement one. It's not going to be bilaterally just targeting Myanmar, because Thailand is also involved. If you look at the kidnapping of Chinese nationals or the abduction of Chinese nationals, first to Thailand and then transfer them to Myanmar. I think the Chinese pointed out that the primary culprit here are the Thais. And this issue has existed in Philippines. It also exists in Cambodia. There are some operations in Laos. So it's not just a Myanmar issue. So I suspect what I have seen out of China is that this will be treated as a regional joint law enforcement issue, like the one we saw after the Mekong killing of 2011. But the question is, how do they bring in the different governments that have different, let's say, vested interest in this?
Yeah. Just quick follow-up, if I may. What about the domestic pressures within China? Are there any in order to, like, for example, the luring of Chinese nationals to these scams? Is there some sort of expectation domestically for Beijing to stop this?
There is. Well, first off, I think that Chinese, when they look at these cases, of course, is seen as a great violation of China's national interest. But on the other hand, if you look at why these people went, they realize that they went for jobs. So they were not forced. It's not like they were kidnapped in China, thrown into a dark truck and shipped across the border to Thailand and then to Myanmar. These people willingly took the job offer, had their passport, and flew to Thailand. And from there, of course, they were lured and then they were shipped to Myanmar. But I think the difference or the distinction is that in the domestic Chinese public opinion, what are the responsibilities that these people need to carry for themselves? With all these warnings that don't go to Myanmar and don't go to Thailand, and this issue of cyber scam operation has become a nationwide or even region-wide one, there are still people, after people, they went to Thailand understanding that there's a certain level of risk. Of course, there's a tendency to portray that the abductors, the kidnappers, they're very strategic, that they have designed their scheme really smartly and lured these people. But I think in a way, it's also a reflection of the domestic economic condition in China, that there is a shortage of jobs, especially for the younger population. And when they see that there's opportunity to get a better pay in Southeast Asia, they took the chance. So to what extent that they need to be responsible rather than people completely blaming the government for not having their back, I think those are two very different stories.
We have, at time of recording, 9-day-old government here in Washington, and they have not had time to come up with a Myanmar policy. But one line of argument that we've heard since the coup, but that I've heard more often in the last week and a half, is this idea that Myanmar policy for the Trump administration should focus on the threat of Chinese domination. You have not folks who are particularly familiar with Myanmar, I think, coming out of the woodwork and saying, look, the only thing that matters is that China's going to dominate post-election Myanmar. They're now all in on the military and they control the northern EROs. And I find that to be an unconvincing case. I think it presumes a degree of control that China doesn't actually have and assumes that the elections are going to grant more legitimacy than they actually would. In which case, I think that that's entirely the wrong way to approach Myanmar policy, or at least that it shouldn't be the primary lens. But maybe I'm wrong. Your thoughts?
Well, we saw this during the first Trump administration, right? Remember the counter-Chinese influence campaign? I think that was more broadly mainland Southeast Asia. I think the issue of the Chinese BRI criminal network to Southeast Asia was one of the angles that people have used to make the argument that we need to up our ante. We need to counter the Chinese influence using I believe that is a congressional legislation term, counter Chinese influence. And we saw some of that in that direction. I think now I agree with you. I don't think the Chinese want the type of control that a lot of people think that China has. They don't want to dictate the politics. They just want to protect their border and have their connectivity projects. I don't think they have any interest in dictating who will be the future leader of the country and what will be the political modality of the new government. But I think the domination of the Chinese influence in Myanmar has been if I can use the word, done deal since an LD government. Because remember, under Aung San Suu Kyi government, our primary issue with Myanmar was Rohingya, was how the NLD government did not stay a principled position on the protection of the Rohingya population, and that severely constrained our ability to work with a democratically elected government in the country. And the Rohingya issue was a priority at that time. So I would argue that even when the country had a democratically elected government, China was much more dominant than we were in the country. You could say their engagement has no principle, and they did not see the Rohingya issue as the deal breaker for their bilateral relations. And that goes to the point that the Chinese engagement or their influence in the country is not contingent upon a certain political force being on top of the government. I think it's contingent upon the fact that China is their largest neighbor and has its influence in the country. And there is the issue of geography. China does share a very long border with Myanmar, and we are a power outside the region. So for us to want to go to the country and counter the Chinese influence is extremely hard. I think the most successful 5 years was under the Thein Sein government, when the Myanmar government was trying to pivot away from China or rebalance its foreign relations. And that was made possible because Thein Sein government was more pro-reform than we had expected. And they were willing to rebalance. But currently, given our position on the human rights issue, on the Rohingya issue, and our position on the country, I find it very difficult for US to compete with China in this particular corner of the world. We can support NUG, right? But is NUG willing to turn its back against China, which they have not really done so far, despite the fact that China has refused to recognize them as a legitimate leader of the resistance even. So if we want to achieve that goal, who are our partners? Who are on the ground? And what is our approach?
Maybe this is a super naive question, but given China's interests in working with regional governments for its own interests, what are the prospects of the US under this administration, and this is me being naive, working with China together with ASEAN countries? Because there is an increased focus on resolving the Myanmar crisis under the Malaysia chairmanship. US-China ASEAN cooperation on Myanmar. What are the prospects?
I'd love to hear Greg's opinion on this. I'm personally not holding my breath. Based on what we know about the Trump's standing policy on China, I find it very difficult to posit that US would abandon the great power competition narrative with China and pursue cooperation in Myanmar simply for the reason that Myanmar is in chaos. I also find it very difficult to posit that US would also prioritize Myanmar at this point because there are a lot of priorities. There's Ukraine, there's Gaza, there's China, there's trade, there's a border. So to what extent that Myanmar is going to be such a priority, I find that hard to assume.
Greg?
I see zero chance of that working. I think there's an outside shot that somebody convinces Trump administration officials to reach out to Beijing and maybe reach out directly to Min Aung Hlaing or those around him to try to, in some kind of four-dimensional chess move, but it wouldn't work. I think the strategic interests of the US and China are just too opposed on that. As for ASEAN is not going to have a position. Yes, I think there will be more focus under Malaysia's chairmanship this year, but the only one that matters is Thailand, and Thailand seems to have gotten fed up with the idea that ASEAN has a say and is pursuing its own separate policy on Myanmar. But the most important reason is that none of these countries have the power to actually resolve the Myanmar crisis. This is for armed actors within Myanmar to resolve. We know what this looks like from a dozen or more cases over the last 20 years. You can look at Syria, you can look at Afghanistan, you can look at the DRC, you could go back farther and look at the Balkans or Yemen for that matter. Outside parties and neighboring states can try to maintain some influence with individual armed actors, but in a multi-front civil war like this, anybody who is so naive as to think that they can dictate terms or be clever enough to resolve the issue is fooling themselves. More likely, they're just going to wade in above their heads and then be trapped. This will get resolved primarily when the people with the guns are mutually exhausted and either one wins or they decide to come to the table.
Well, I just thought I'd throw that moonshot out there just in case.
Nope, I'm still a bummer. Sorry.
No, I think we have had our hopes on ASEAN since day one of this coup, right? ASEAN had a 5-point consensus, and I think ASEAN has been criticized for not being able to enforce it. And there is very little cause for SAC not to enforce it, and there are complaints. And I've heard this analogy that ASEAN is actually like an HOA association. You can criticize and give your members the look, but you can't really kick them out because they are here. They're geographically a part of the region, and by kicking them out, you are not going to benefit in any way. So I find that ASEAN's utility on this issue has been quite limited. If there's going to be a solution, I agree with Greg, it will have to be organic. It has to come from within, right? Nobody can impose a solution. But I think outside powers can play a constructive role in that process. That will require much more coordination among the donors, among the great powers, and also with UN. I still think that I could be wrong. Cambodia could be a comparable example here, that the chaos eventually led to the great powers making an agreement at UN, and in the end, there was a UN intervention. But that was against the background of decades of tragedy in the country, and certainly hope we don't have to go there.
Yeah, and I'm by no means arguing for a hands-off approach to Myanmar. I just think we have to be realistic that the best outside parties can do is nudge. I think it is important to maintain influence as much as possible with the actors who will eventually sit at that table and determine Myanmar's future. But the idea that we can help set the timetable for when they do that seems Pollyannish and potentially quite dangerous to me.
I don't think anyone's arguing for an imposition of a solution from the outside, though. And I think nudging might be the right word, just to try to move the situation along so that the internal actors and stakeholders have an actual say in how the country's future moves forward.
And that would require the exhaustion of the people with guns.
Right. And to be clear, like we talk about US, China, ASEAN, within that consortium of 11 outside countries, you've got at least 3 or 4 positions on who is actually most legitimate to sit at that table and negotiate the future of Myanmar, which I think also mitigates against the idea that the US and China, we might both come in and say we agree that the chaos should end, but who should be at that table and who has the right to be and who should come out on top? The US and China have diametrically opposed opinions about that. And so do individual members of ASEAN.
And so do people within Myanmar.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we're way over time, which is fine because our Myanmar episodes always end up being way over time, just getting through the acronyms. But we are going to put a pin in it there. Yun, thank you so much for coming over and joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Elina, awesome to be back in person in studio. Thanks so much for doing it.
Yes. Thank you for welcoming me into the studio.
And thanks all of you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the next episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org, and we'll be sure to answer any burning questions you may have.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our interns are Sophia Datta and Gemma King. Our co-hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.